Hello and welcome to the Public Sector Debate Competition. We're now at the octafinals. Can you believe it? That's the round of the top 16 teams. I'm Aniki Clark, Communication Lead in the TIU and your host for this match. We're really happy to have you join us. It's been a great start yesterday for the octafinal rounds, and the first 4 teams have been confirmed for the quarterfinals. So today we will know who are the final 4. If you miss those matches, you can always catch up on our Facebook page or YouTube channel. This morning we have a very exciting MOOT to be debated, and that MOOT will be debated by the National Fisheries Authority as the proponent and the Universal Service Fund as the opponent. Let's give them a round of applause. We know you're very excited to hear the arguments, and so are we. But before we do that, we'll ask the teams to introduce themselves, starting with the proponent, the National Fisheries Authority.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ashika Howell, first speaker for Team Proposition.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kemisha Harrison Plummer. I am the second speaker for Team Proposition.
Good morning, everyone. The name is Zara Oliphant, and I am the third speaker for Team Proposition.
Thank you so much, Team NFA, and we now ask Team Universal Service Fund to introduce themselves.
Morning, everyone. My name is Omar Williams, and I'll be the first speaker for the opposition.
Good morning, everyone. I am Nepatra Bennett, and I am the second speaker for the opposition.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ayana Bennett, and I'll be the opposition reply speaker.
Thank you very much, Team USF. And the MOOT to be debated is, be it resolved that cultural norms should not dictate the legislative process. What are your views on that MOOT? We want to hear it. So give us your thoughts in the comments. But before that, we invite the judges from the Jamaican Association for Debating and Empowerment, JADE, to introduce themselves.
Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Javon Downey, and I'll be serving as the chair judge for this match.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Kenisha Nelson, and I'll be one of your wing judges for this match.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm Curtis Wallace, and I'm the other wing adjudicator.
Thank you so much, judges. We're looking forward to the arguments. And at this point, I will turn over to Chair Adjudicator to marshal the match. Good luck, teams.
Thank you very much, Aniki. At this stage, all the teams are already familiar with the rule, but just to briefly recap, you're allotted your respective speaking times, varying from 7, 6, and 5 minutes at the first 1 minute mark and the last minute mark in your speech is protected time will indicate by the ding of a bell. When you have eclipsed your time, the bell will ding twice, after which you're allotted a further 15 seconds to wrap up your presentations and then requested to yield the floor. We'll have 2 periods of cross-examination, and we'll delve more into that when we get there. So without further ado, let's get this debate underway with the submissions from the first proposition speaker. Hear, hear.
Adjudicators, esteemed members of the opposition, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I begin this debate by acknowledging a truth. Culture is the heartbeat of a people. It is the language of our identity and the rhythm that shapes the world we see. But when it comes to the law, culture must inform, not control. Justice demands consistency, evidence, and fairness, not tradition alone. And that is why we firmly support the motion. Cultural norms should not dictate the legislative process. To ensure clarity, let me first define our key terms. The legislative process refers to the steps through which laws are proposed, debated, refined, and enacted in Parliament. This includes policy formulation, drafting, public consultation, debate in the House of Representatives and Senate, and final approval. Cultural norms are the customs, beliefs, traditions, and social behaviors that are widely accepted by a group of people. The term dictate refers to authoritative rule or command. We build our arguments on 3 critical pillars. that culture is far too diverse to serve as a legislative compass. Our laws must be driven by data and remain uniform with global standards. Secondly, a culturally dictated process promotes a breach to our very own constitution. Lastly, a hybrid approach for a culturally influenced evidence-based legislative process that is more just. Our second speaker will provide further analysis and real examples of these points and further construct our impenetrable fortress of arguments that cement our stance. The opposition will argue that cultural norms should dictate the legislative process. We challenge them to provide empirical evidence and concrete examples demonstrating how cultural norms can be the authority of our legislative process without compromising on principles of equity and justice. The burden of proof lies with the opposition to show that cultural norms, if prioritized, will not undermine the rule of law and stability of a global framework. With that in mind, I lay the foundation of our arguments. Culture is not monolithic. It is a tapestry, rich, beautiful, shaped by our history of colonization, slavery, and migration. We are a melting pot of varied beliefs, practices, and norms that make us so rich in our own way. From a local perspective, we see where the beliefs of a Pentecostal pastor in St. Elizabeth does not mirror those of a Rastafarian farmer in St. Thomas and differ from a corporate executive in New Kingston. What is considered normative for one social class may be taboo in another. Culture is not one thing. It is 1,000 traditions, perspectives, and prejudices, many of them contradictory. Culture is not constant. Can we truly base a system of governance off uncertainty? This cultural diversity should be celebrated and should guide the legislation, but not dictate it. Effective legislation should be grounded in empirical evidence and aimed at promoting justice and equity. According to the World Bank's governance indicators, countries with strong institutional frameworks, including standardized legislative processes, tend to have higher scores on the Rule of Law Index, which is an indicator of how the law is perceived by the everyday people. A World Bank study reveals that countries that prioritize universal principles in their legislation can actually experience a 12% higher GDP growth rates. Let's look at the Fisheries Act. The 2018 Fisheries Act was created in response to chronic overfishing, environmental degradation, and declining fish stocks, despite the significant pushback from local fishers. The law included stronger penalties, gear restrictions, and conservation zones, not to punish, but to protect the livelihood of future generations. Local practices that were culturally entrenched were destroying fish populations, coral reefs, and Jamaica's long-term food security. Fishers refusing to comply, claiming, a God see no man can tell them how to fish. But culture cannot justify ecological suicide. As the economist Dr. Dambiso Moyo argues, nations that prioritize tradition over transformation end up memorializing their poverty. Culture is fluid. It evolves, it divides, it disagrees. The law, however, must do the opposite, must unify, standardize, and protect everyone equally. We cannot build consistent policy on shifting cultural sands. The moment we allow culture to dictate our laws, we open the door to unconstitutional, discriminatory legislation. Any law that serves one group while excluding another is not just unjust.
Point of information.
You can go ahead.
Laws are passed for universal protection, is it?
Right, and also protecting the rights of all individuals, not just a specific group. So I will follow up at that point, but a direct attack on our right to equality, which is our constitutional right. What we advocate for is a hybrid approach, a culturally influenced but evidence-based legislative process. This is a participatory approach that will value citizen engagement and democratic principles while ensuring laws protect individual rights and promote economic growth. Evidence-based processes involve creating policies that are grounded in empirical research data, analysis, and scientific evidence. According to CDB, 80% of the citizens do believe that cultural norms should inform but not dictate the legislative process. By adopting this hybrid-based approach, we can create a more efficient, effective, and responsive legislative process that promotes social and economic development. Therefore, our model is not culture-averse. It is culture-aware. It treats culture as input and as advisory, but not authority. Culture is valuable, but it is not infallible. When we allow it to dictate our laws, we risk enshrining inequality and halting progress. The law must serve justice and equity, not just for a specific group, but for all. Thank you.
We thank the first proposition speaker for opening the debate in good spirits, and now to do the same, we invite the first opposition speaker. Hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker, judges, my worthy opponents, we rise today to firmly oppose the MOOT. Be it resolved that cultural norms should not dictate the legislative process. Now, I want to start by clearing the air. This debate isn't about whether cultural norms should influence the law. The MOOT uses a stronger word, dictate, to direct, determine, to set the terms. Let me begin by clearly defining our key terms. Cultural norms refers to the shared values, beliefs, practices, and expectations that define acceptable behavior within a society. These include moral codes, religious traditions, and social customs. The legislative process, this is the mechanism by which societies develop, pass, and implement laws. Dictate means to exercise authoritative or decisive control over something, prescribe or determine the outcome in a commanding way. The proposition will have you believe that this is dangerous, that letting culture dictate the law is a recipe for bias or injustice. But we, the opposition, will show that when cultural norm dictates the legislative process, we get laws that create sustainable change, protect rights and identity. Point. My second speaker will further explain. In a world where law ignores the cultural norms of the people, it does not become fairer, it becomes more fragile. It loses legitimacy and breaks trust, and eventually it fails. So we say this boldly. There are moments, and many of them, when culture must not only influence but dictate the law. Mr. Speaker, how can the opposition support this MOOT when it is due to cultural norms in 1833 that led to the passing of the Emancipation Act, where slaves, our forefathers, were no longer properties but became free men? Shifting attitudes toward morality, human rights, and economic justice increasingly clash with the institution of slavery. Cultural norms rejected legitimacy of slavery and compelled political leaders to act, which led to slavery being legally abolished in Britain and the colonial empire. Another example, prohibition in the US. The government banned alcohol in the 1920s. There was a lack of public support and widespread disregard for the law. People drank anyway, illegally, constantly. Enforcement was a nightmare. The law collapsed under its own weight because culture didn't just resist, it rejected. Mr. Speaker, let's talk about the issue to repeal the colonial-era buggery law, which criminalizing consensual same-sex relations between adults under the 1864 Offenses Against the Person Act. In 2014, the then leader of opposition, Andrew Holness, responded to the issue by recommending that the matter be resolved through a referendum, meaning let's put it to the people. We, the opposition, believe that this is a clear example of how the Christian culture and conservatism in Jamaica directs the legislative process. My opponents, can you imagine this law being repealed in Jamaica without the consultation or input of the culture? This is the danger of rejecting cultural norms in lawmaking. You don't get order, you get alienation. You don't get progress, you get resistance. When the people do not see themselves in the law, they will not follow it. Mr. Speaker, what happens when culture is not just consulted but allowed to dictate the legislative process? You get laws that land, laws that last, laws that work. Case in point, ganja reform. For decades, ganja was criminalized, even though Rastas use it spiritually. farmers use it economically, and the public use it medicinally. The culture spoke one truth, but the law told another. And so people ignored the law. Then came 2015. Jamaica decriminalized small amounts, recognized spiritual use, protected traditional knowledge. The results, compliance went up, tension with police went down, and trust in the legal system grew. The Gleaner called it a turning point, and not just for cannabis, but for justice, because the law finally followed culture, and in doing so, gained power. Another example, the Noise Abatement Act. Now, this law might seem minor, just a curfew on parties, but in a country where music is the voice of the people, where it feeds families and defines identities, a curfew is more than a policy, it's a cultural attack. Artists, vendors, and economists spoke out, because this wasn't just about decibels, it was about dignity. The government failed to realize that when you lock off the dance, you're not just turning off music, you're eliminating livelihoods. That's why any meaningful reform of the law cannot happen without culture dictating the terms. Because if you don't understand the rhythm of the people, how can you regulate the beat of the nation? Let's look at Ghana. Conservation laws there have succeeded, not because of policing, but because they are rooted in cultural beliefs, and sacred forests. Elders led the charge, communities obey. Why? Because the law wasn't dropped from the sky. It came from the ground up. And during COVID-19, the Jamaican government set early curfew hours, expected full compliance, but they didn't account for how people live. How many relied on informal vending? How many lived in multi-generational homes? How many depended on night markets and community worship? People broke the rules, not because they were defiant, but because the rules ignored their reality. Only when government listened to the culture, extended market hours, engaged in churches, adjusted messages, did things began to click. Culture dictated the fix, and it worked. We're not saying that every norm is perfect, not at this moment, my opponent, but even when culture must change, it cannot be ignored. Because when you can't challenge a cultural norm, if you refuse to engage it. So we ask, can a law survive if it speaks over its people? Can it work if it disrespects their rhythm? We say no. Jamaica and across the world, culture is not a soft influence, it's a commanding force. It doesn't just serve as a seat at the table, it often sets the table. And that is why, with pride, clarity, and conviction, we oppose this motion. The opposition pauses.
And we are off to a fiery start. Equally spirited submissions from both first speakers, and that takes us into our first period of cross-examination, where we'll field questions from opposition to proposition, questions limited to 10 seconds, and responses capped at 30 seconds. Opposition, pose your questions. Yes.
My opponent. In a democratic country such as Jamaica, where laws reflect the values of the people they govern, how can you separate these values from culture?
The thing about Jamaica is that, as our first speaker said, culture is diverse. And it's important that in the legislative process, the different aspects of culture be considered. So it's not separating the values from the culture, it's recognizing that there are different aspects to our culture, and so all have to be considered in the legislative process. It cannot prioritize one over the other.
Then my opponents, if not culture, what would determine if a law is outdated?
Research, data, science, while giving consideration to the stakeholder consultative process. So stakeholders are consulted in the legislative process. However, it is best practices, standard research that needs to dictate how the law itself is crafted.
Final question.
Okay. Are you advocating for a system where laws are imposed despite public opposition?
Could you repeat that question, please?
Are you advocating for a system where laws are imposed despite public opposition?
Thank you for that question. That's a really good question. However, our approach, we're advocating that the rights of an individual should take priority, should take precedence. We cannot ignore individual rights and the values, and we are not positing that we ignore cultural values, but if that is necessary for a change, then we may have to bypass the backlash we receive. As seen, a lot of acts are implemented despite cultural pushback based on the statistics and the data and how it may improve the overall quality of life for our Jamaican people and our individual rights.
That's time. Thank you very much, opposition, for your questions. Proposition, it's time for you to field questions.
Okay, first question to you, or opposition. How do you reconcile the idea of respecting cultural traditions with the need to protect rights and promote equality?
Well, we accept the fact that culture is a representation of many different persons' belief and so on. So in regards to passing legislative process, we believe that representative of each culture should be a part of any decision making or any process that needs to be implemented.
Right. You had mentioned in your speech the curfew and the DRMA Act. Wasn't the health of the citizens more important at that time than the cultural norms?
What we pointed out is that the implementation of the act was done without proper consultation of the people and the livelihood of the people. We are not neglecting the fact that people's health or the citizens' health was as important, but also health goes beyond just checkups and all of that. It further entails livelihood such as food, such as earning ability, and so on. And mental health is also important as well.
Final question.
How would you evaluate what cultural practices would be prioritized in the legislative process?
As we said earlier, culture is a representation of many different facets of people, types of people. So in order for cultural norms to dictate the legislative process, it would need representation of all these different groups of persons, and then a decision can be made as to how the values and rights of all is represented.
We thank both teams for a very interesting period of cross-questioning, and we'll continue this debate with the submission from the second proposition speaker. Hear, hear.
I unwaveringly second this motion and will continue to construct our fortress of arguments building on the strong foundation we have thus far. Mr. Speaker, my opponents seem misguided. We are not here to say that culture should dictate, never, but we don't undermine the role of culture. Culture should influence, and that is where we will agree on. Culture, he spoke about protect rights and identity. Culture sometimes discriminates because culture is likely to protect who is in the culture, not those outside of it. He also spoke about the culture, the culture in the colonial period, and the point is, at that time, slavery was the culture. Our position is not to reject culture, but as they have conceded, to be consulted. The COVID-19 period, as we spoke about, the law has to protect the people even when the people don't want to protect themselves. And I will go into my arguments. Firstly, culture is too far diverse and contradictory to serve as a fair legislative compass. Whilst culture provides a shared framework of understanding values that shape a society, cultural norms may negatively impact legislation by leading to discrimination and inequality in lawmaking. An example of a disenfranchised group due to cultural norm dictating the law are the women in Iran. According to Amnesty International 2024, the authorities has intensified crackdown on basic freedoms, with minorities and women facing ongoing discrimination and harsh punishment like flogging and amputation. This is what happens when culture is allowed to dictate. A sect of society becomes alienated. While some countries
Point of information.
have a high degree of cultural homogeneity, all countries exhibit some degree of cultural diversity. A prime example of a country with diverse cultures is Nepal, home to over 140 ethnic groups. If Nepal should let culture dictate its legislation process, there would be chaos. Some persons will be left out. Let's look closer within Jamaica. There are several subsets of culture. Which do we choose to dictate the law? Maybe my opponents can decide. The role of stakeholders, according to the guidelines of the development of national policies, and by extension, culture, is to inform, consult, involve, collaborate, and empower, not to dictate. Laws must be able to measure up to best practices, international standards, and stand up to scrutiny. When domestic laws are shaped primarily by cultural norms, especially those that conflict with international standards, it can affect how Jamaica is perceived on the global stage. Empirical evidence and best practices must be the backbone of the lawmaking process, as it helps to inform policy decision, ensure that laws are effective and relevant, and ensure that no culture is left behind. Secondly, if culture is allowed to dictate the legislative process, there is a great potential to breach one's constitutional rights. Culture is fluid and influenced by internal and external forces, new ideas and technologies. Given its fluidity, once culture is used as a basis to dictate the legislative process, that law in and of itself is likely to be unconstitutional. Laws must be universal, binding, and enforceable, and never lead to inequality or marginalization regardless of gender, race, or ethnicity. The Constitution of Jamaica serves as the supreme law in our country and can override cultural norms when they conflict with constitutional protections, upholding justice over tradition. Since independence to present, cultures within Jamaica have changed dramatically. Parliamentarians would have to set up bunk beds in Parliament to update laws if culture were to dictate. Just imagine, the cost to taxpayers would be so unbearable. My third and final point, as my first speaker said, is an hybrid approach, a culturally influenced but evidence-based legislative process, which already exists within our legislative process. This approach includes conducting impact assessment using scientific research and data-driven decision-making processes, as well as stakeholder consultations. And who are our stakeholders? The people. We have seen where this approach has proven successful in countries such as Canada, New Zealand, and Rwanda, where it has improved effectiveness, enhanced accountability, ensure efficient allocation of resources, and increase public trust. In conclusion, it is safe to say culture is not an adequate basis to dictate legislation. I thank you.
We thank the second proposition speaker for her spirited contributions as well to this debate. And now we welcome the second opposition speaker. Hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker, esteemed judges, colleagues, the proposition would have you believe that cultural norms are outdated relics, obstacles to progress. Rather, cultural norms are living systems of belief shaped by generations of experience and firmly rooted in how people understand and interpret the world around them. Should cultural norms dictate the legislative process? We say yes, Because to dictate is to guide authoritatively. And when a norm is embedded so deeply in a society that it reflects its collective identity, then yes, it should dictate how the society is governed. We are not defending every tradition. We are saying that a legislative process must reflect the cultural realities of the people it seeks to regulate. It should dictate how that society is governed. We are not defending every tradition. We are saying that the legislative process must reflect the cultural realities of the people it seeks to regulate. When it doesn't, the law fails. I will now advance two arguments that cultural norms, one, provides a foundation for legal stability and sustainable change, and two, it protects minority rights and community identity. On matters of legal stability and sustainable change, laws only work when they are seen as legitimate. And legitimacy doesn't come from the parliament alone. It comes from the people. In the early 2000s, government of Malawi attempted to ban traditional healers. Despite public health intentions, the law failed miserably. Reuters' investigation indicated that over 80% of the population relied on these traditional practices, leading to a widespread non-compliance and eventual repeal of the law as it ignored the cultural reality of Malawi. We see the same interplay in the Children Guardianship Custody Act. In Jamaica, child rearing often extends beyond the nuclear family. As we say, it takes a village to raise a child. According to the Jamaica Observer, this law recognizes grandparents, aunties, and other relatives as legitimate guardians, a clear example of culture dictating legislation in a meaningful, modern way. Laws built to confront harmful cultural practices provide a framework not only to reduce, but to ultimately eliminate those practices over time.
Points of information?
Not at this time. The 2023 amendment to Jamaica's Domestic Violence Act demonstrates how aligning legislation with evolving cultural norms promote legal stability and sustainable change. The 2018 National Prevalence Survey found nearly 1 in 3 women experience gender-based violence and 1 in 4 face intimate partner violence. Years of advocacy reframed domestic violence as a public concern, not a private matter. In response, the amended law introduced stronger protections and harsher penalties. By 2023, the Jamaica Constabulary Force reported domestic abuse cases reached 8,500, with 6,000 reported to the Domestic Violence Intervention Centers, reflected increased public trust and stronger enforcement. India's Prohibition of Child Marriage Act of 2006 proves that aligning laws with evolving cultural norms drives lasting change. It sets clear minimum age for marriages, 18 for girls, 21 for boys, and gives authorities power to intervene and educate. Picture this: an 8-year-old girl forced to marry a 60-year-old man so her family can collect a dowry. This is the injustice the Act targets. Thanks to strong enforcement, child marriage rates fell from 47.4% to 23.3% by 2019, as reported by Minister Annapurna Devi. This is how legal clarity transforms harmful traditions into protection for the vulnerable. 2. Cultural norms, but not at this time. Cultural norms protect minority rights and community identity. Laws must reflect the diversity of the people they serve, not erase it. In pluralistic democracies, culture isn't just decoration, it's identity. And when ignored, it's oppression. Let's look at the Maroons of Jamaica. These communities have fought for their land rights, sovereignty, and recognition for a generation. As noted by Dr. Vereen Shepherd, writing in the Gleaner in 2022, ignoring Maroon rights is to continue colonial injustice under a different name. Their struggles isn't just legal, it's cultural. Any legislation that governs their land or their people must be built on the values they live by. Or take the Maya land rights in Belize. In 2015, the CCJ ruled in favor of the Maya communities whose land practices had been ignored by the states. As stated in the CCJ judgment and reported by the Environmental Law Alliance Worldwide, customary land tenure is not incompatible with modern justice. It is a form of justice. In this case, culture didn't just inform the land, it dictated it, and rightfully so. On the flip side, let's examine what happens when laws ignores culture. France's 2004 ban on religious symbols in public schools, including the hijab, was framed as a secular neutrality. But as reported by the Human Rights Watch, it disproportionately affected Muslim girls and stigmatized their identity. This is what happens when the laws pretend to be neutral while ignoring whose culture it erases. Mr. Speaker, we are saying that when a culture is widely accepted and fundamental to how people live, when it defines their values, practices, and community, it must dictate the laws that governs them. Cultural norms are not the enemies of justice. They are the foundation on which justice can stand. To legislate without culture is to write laws no one follows. To legislate without culture is to spark resistance. But to legislate with culture, that's how you build lasting, legitimate change. We are proud to oppose the motion. Be it resolved that cultural norms should not dictate the legislative process. The opposition pauses.
We thank the second opposition speaker for her contributions to this debate, and now we'll enter the final period of cross-examination, where once again, opposition will field questions to proposition. Opposition, you're up.
If culture is constantly evolving, how can you claim it's inherently unfit to dictate modern legislation?
For the same reason that you said it's constantly evolving. So on what basis would you determine that the cultural practices of the Rastafarian versus the cultural practices of a Pentecostal pastor versus the cultural practices of the executive in New Kingston is what should dictate the law?
No, they're responding. So you are asking questions. Next question.
My opponent, are you advocating for a system where laws are imposed despite public opposition rooted in cultural values?
If the laws are protecting the people, then we will be in agreement. We are not opposed to culture. We're saying it should not dictate, and therefore, persons who might be affected by some laws, as you have said about COVID, whilst COVID was a pandemic, it was in and of itself a situation that the government had to act with or without the people consent, because the law is made to protect the people.
My opponent, how do you remove the beliefs of the legislators in the legislative process?
There is no removal, but empirical evidence should stand firm, regardless of your belief, regardless of how you feel, regardless of how you were grown up. The empirical evidence and data should stand up. That is what will stand up to scrutiny, not culture. Not that we're dismissing culture, because we will never dismiss culture. However, at the end of all public consultation and all the research that was done, it has to stand up to scrutiny. Whether or
And that's time. We thank opposition for their questions, and now we'll entertain the questions from proposition.
You mentioned that cultural norms can lead, if not considered, can lead to failure, right? Can you say what cultural norms led to, for example, the Cybercrimes Act being passed?
With the emergence of changes again in culture, and what is now accepted as norms and what is happening in society, that's where the necessary research would come into play to ensure that we are adhering to, we have the necessary legislation in place so that our culture or people are able to adhere to something that is not inherently illegal.
Okay, what mechanisms would you propose to ensure that cultural practices do not perpetuate discrimination or injustice if it dictates the legislation?
It is important to know when you're thinking of legislative processes, the aim is not equality but equity. Let's take, for example, religious freedom. The right to religious freedom doesn't say, oh, because you're in a Christian society, you must be Christian. Rastas are allowed to worship here, Muslims, Christians, the like. Therefore, the aim of any legislative process remains at all times to promote equity.
Final question from proposition.
All right, final question. How would you balance the preservation of cultural legislation with the need for laws that will adapt to a changing world.
That's actually what we're saying. We're saying every time there's a shift in cultural norms, the laws have shifted to adjust with the shifting cultural norms.
All right, we have come to the end of the second period of cross-examination. We thank both teams for an engaging period of cross-examination, and at this point, the debate will pause for 1 minute to allow the finishing touches to be put on the reply speeches, after which we'll resume with the submission from the opposition reply speaker. That 1 minute starts now. That is time, and at this point, to close out the debate and side opposition, we will invite the opposition reply speaker. Here, here.
Mr. Speaker, judges, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Let's not tiptoe around the real issue here. The debate isn't just about legal theory, it's about how people live. And the big question remains, should cultural norms dictate the legislative process? The opposition says yes. We are saying culture matters. Cultural norms inform the very research you keep mentioning. It's the identity of the people. It's the soil where law must take root. When a law grows out of what people already know and live, it feels familiar, natural, and becomes enforceable. The proposition says cultural norms shouldn't dictate legislation. But how do they think the legislative process works in democratic countries such as Jamaica? It's not done in a vacuum. Joint select committees invite public input. Civil society groups make submissions. The people, the culture, have a voice. So when the proposition says culture should not dictate the legislative process, what are they really saying? That we should ignore how democracy works, that the people should sit out the process that governs their lives? That's not progress. That's exclusion wrapped in legal jargon. Look at Jamaica's ganja laws. Those didn't shift because of a press release. They changed because cultural norms had already changed. Communities were using it, medicinally, spiritually, day to day. The law didn't lead that shift. It caught up. And because it was finally in sync with how people lived, it worked. And then the proposition brought up universal human rights and cultural discrimination, as if culture and rights can't coexist. But let's be clear, cultural norms have often shaped and dictated the very laws that stand against harmful practices. In fact, laws that protect human rights frequently arise in response to cultural norms that once violated them. As my second speaker highlighted, take the example of India, where legislation banning child marriage was introduced precisely because the cultural practice existed. That law wasn't passed in a vacuum. It was a legal response shaped and dictated by cultural context, not removed from it. Same goes for gender equality. That didn't come from a courtroom. It came from decades of women demanding more. Cultural norms changed, expectations changed, and the law had to follow. That's why today my opponents can vote. You can drive, you have access to reproductive health care, legal protection from domestic abuse. All of that exists because shifting cultural norms pushed the issue forward. Cultural norms dictated the legislative process. So no, culture and human rights aren't enemies, they're teammates. Culture starts the conversation, the law helps finish it. Now the proposition also said culture is too inconsistent to trust. But we say the evolution of culture is what determines that a law is outdated. Culture's flexibility, that's its power. It adapts, it moves. And when law considers culture and not ignore it, is when change settles in and takes hold. As the saying goes, the law is the public conscience. So ask yourself, whose conscience are we talking about if not the people's? And what shapes that conscience more than cultural norms? Thus proving the point that cultural norms already dictate and must continue to dictate the legislative process. Finally, let's address the proposition concerns for the rights of vulnerable groups. Take, for example, the LGBTQ+ community. The fight for LGBTQ+ rights, like the legalization of same-sex marriage in the US, shows how cultural shifts often lead to change in legal reform. But let's be honest, what's embraced in one society may clash with the cultural realities of another. For example, Jamaica's legislative process must reflect its own social context, not ideals imported from elsewhere. Because when laws are shaped without regard for local culture, they miss the mark. We have proven to you today that, 1, culture provides a foundation for legal stability. 2, culture drives sustainable change. 3, culture protects community identity and minority rights. And 4, cultural dictation produces legitimacy and compliance. So here's what I'll leave you with. Cultural norms act as a catalyst for legal changes reflecting societal values and priorities. They lead to more inclusive, equitable, and just laws that respond to the needs of a diverse population. Culture isn't some footnote in legislation, it's the whole foundation. In light of everything presented today, the opposition firmly maintains that cultural norms should and must dictate the legislative process. The opposition rests.
With a nicely wrapped bow, the opposition case has come to an end, and now we invite to do the same the proposition reply speaker to close out the debate on that side and in totality. Hear, hear.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. Let me also thank the opposition for their example of the child marriages in India, because that is actually in support of our point. The cultural practice of child marriages, that was not a good practice, and so data, best practices, global standards were able to inform that that is wrong, and as a result, the legislative process changed. The opponents also mentioned the Ganja law. However, as we said, the Pentecostal pastor and many Christians would not have agreed to that. What influenced decriminalization was research and data showing the benefits of this particular plant and the impact of a minimum amount on an individual. Yes, culture influenced, but it did not dictate. They said that, for example, laws do not ignore the culture of the people, right? And we have never stated that. It is created for the benefit of the people, equality and fairness before the law. We also never said that cultural norms are an obstacle to progress. The opponents here are not listening. We never said that. Now, science also, in another example you use about grandparents, aunts, and uncles, relatives, that was science. They are relatives scientifically related to an individual, so of course the law would account for them being relatives. Culture, however, says that the neighbor next door is auntie and the man down the road is uncle. That was not legislated. Now, as we have said before, culture is a tapestry. And in Jamaica, it is beautifully woven within the threads of out of many one people. We acknowledge that cultural norms should guide. And we have also mentioned the consultative process, the stakeholder process. However, we are not conceding to the opposition stance. Let that be clear. Cultural norms should guide the process. However, it should not dictate it, because it is important to use research, best practices, international standards as the dictating factors over cultural norms. That is what will allow for a more balanced and non-discriminatory law. Now, our speakers highlighted, and I will just reiterate, It is a discriminatory law that would arise out of a legislative process that caters to only one sector of the society and not the others. Our laws, as you spoke about equity, we agree it should be developed in light of our constitutional right for equality and equity and ensure that all aspects of culture are served. And as a result, culture alone cannot dictate. Now, as we mentioned before, Jamaica is a signatory to many international treaties which reflect global standards on equality and justice. Now, just for example, imagine if these international treaties were dictated by culture. That would be chaos. You also mentioned an example of the LGBTQ in the US. That was an interesting example because look at what that has caused. It is chaotic in the US right now. Now, the opposition has failed the burden of proof was on them to prove that cultural norms should dictate, but I submit to you that they have failed to do so. Are they really suggesting that we must waste public funds because culture is shifting? Every year the culture shifts to something. We're back in parliament in the bunk beds. Or are you saying that in the absence of cultural norms, there should be no legislative process? That is a dangerous assertion. We highlighted the Fisheries Act. What were the cultural norms? Go catch anything out of sea. Catch it, eat it. But science said that we must manage it for the future and current generations. Another law, for example, how much people was putting money under their mattress? Millions of dollars in partner draw, but look at POCA Act coming in because of safety and ensuring that citizens are safe and also ensuring that we don't have money laundering. And I'll use one more example. The Telecommunications Universal Service Levy number 2 order of 2011. It was an amendment of the Telecommunications Act introducing a levy on incoming calls from international. What does that mean? That means they had to set up an agency called the Universal Service Fund. What cultural norm actually dictated that? No. It was important for universal service, but at the time, persons never really know about that. Now, we are just saying, to be clear, culture is too wide, too fluid, and too diverse to dictate our legislative process. It plays a role in the passenger seat, yes, but it cannot dictate. It cannot dictate. What should dictate is standards, research, best practices that benefit all the cultures within the beautiful tapestry of our society. We rest our case.
And for concluding the debate in beautiful fashion, we thank the proposition reply speaker. Now over to Aniki.
Thank you so much. Let's hear it for the teams one more time. Very strong arguments on both sides, and I wouldn't want to be the judges at this point, but they are masters and mistresses. It was a very good match. You know, I sat there glued to the arguments, and the teams have delivered well. And I'm sure in another 20 or so minutes, let's hope we don't go too far beyond that, we will have the chair adjudicators' summation of the match and the announcement of the winner. But just to remind you that the teams debating were the National Fisheries Authority as the proponent and the Universal Service Fund as the opponent, and they debated the MOOT. Be it resolved that cultural norms should not dictate the legislative process. For those of you on our social media platforms, keep the conversation going. We want to hear your views on this MOOT. And the next voice you will hear will be that of the chair adjudicator, who will make the necessary announcement. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Well done.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. The round of applause is befitting for the caliber of the match that we just witnessed. Just a reminder, the motion the motion being contested is, be it resolved that cultural norms should not dictate the legislative process. In proposition, we have the National Fisheries Authority, and in opposition, we have the Universal Service Fund. And what an interesting debate it was that we had witnessed. Arguments emanating from both sides, equally persuasive, and as a panel of adjudicators, we had quite the task to come to the final deliberation and consensus. So let's get straight into the process or the deliberation. One of the key things that stood out to us was the contextualization of the debate. So on side proposition, they contextualized the debate to say that cultural norms should not dictate the legislative process, but rather empirical data and research should be what is priority, should be what is standard, right? And on side opposition, we get a direct contestation to that by saying cultural norms should in fact dictate the legislative process because culture legitimizes what people feel. Culture legitimizes the reality. Based on that framing of the debate, we got some very interesting ideas. And the key turning point of this debate, there were really two. Firstly, the role of culture. In proposition world, proposition tells us that culture can be divisive, culture can be discriminatory, and there are various subsets of culture within Jamaica, and not just Jamaica, but on a global scale. When we look at culture, there are various subcultures that exist in whatever space it is. And if we are going to allow culture to dictate the legislative process, then more often than not, you are going to find some groups being disproportionately affected, some groups being discriminated against because their culture might not be what is popular. Opposition contends, however, that in fact what culture does is that culture humanifies and culture legitimizes these people. So even though they are a small subset, the fact that the culture is dictating, the culture is making it equitable for all of these various subgroups to thrive. That is how they characterize the clash. And on that specific clash where the role of culture is concerned, we believe that opposition won that clash. The next major turning point in this debate, and this is the major one, was the flexibility of culture. On proposition, we get this idea that culture is not a monolith, it's a tapestry, and culture consistently changes. And if we are going to allow culture to dictate the legislative process, that will not only be time-consuming, it will be costly. Because what we will find is that we'll have to continually be amending laws to meet the various and the diversified needs of the people that we are seeking to govern, right? They also tell us that there are going to be equality concerns for all groups. And then we kind of had a sub-clash of equality and equity. And we saw, as a panel of adjudicators, some convergence there, because both teams were in essence saying that culture should be consulted, or cultural inputs are important, but the main difference is what should dictate and what should not dictate, right? So that is what we got coming out of proposition. On opposition side of the house, where flexibility of culture is concerned, they tell us that the consistent changes in culture makes it organic. And this is why constant amendment is possible, because again, culture is perceived to be fluid. And they spoke about referendums for issues that are topical so that we can get the input of all the various subsectors in society. Also, we get from opposition this idea that where equality and inclusivity is concerned, representatives from various groups should be engaged so that all the relevant subsets of culture can be consulted and their inputs be considered and implemented in the legislative process. Because again, if culture is what legitimizes, then we need all of the various inputs. We as a panel of adjudicators thought that this was a closely contested match. And just one final comment before I announce the winner. Just a general caution. When you're debating certain motions, sometimes it doesn't work best in your favor to play it safe, right? If, like in a motion as this, it is best sometimes to take a hardball stance to say this has no place and it should be entirely focused we should entirely focus on the alternative that you are presenting. Because when you concede in certain emotions, there are places for concessions in certain debates, but when you concede to a certain degree in a certain emotion, it kind of looks as if you are agreeing with the arguments that are being proffered by another team. And with that said, the winner of this match emerging on 281 points, and the second place team closely behind on 276 is the side in opposition, Universal Service Fund. We thought that the best speaker for this debate also comes from the winning team and is Ayana Bennett, the reply speaker. We want to thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoy this match. Stay tuned for the next match that comes up in a couple minutes. I invite both teams to cross the floor and shake hands.